The following interview was conducted as a part of a project by the Madison County Military Heritage Commission to inform and enlighten young people and the community as a whole about the sacrifices made by those in the military on battlefields around the world. We wish to thank the Huntsville School System and the Lehigh Broadcast Center for their help in presenting this Military Heritage Program.
Hello, I'm Tom Kennemer. Welcome to our Price of Freedom interview series. Today our conversation will be with Vietnam veteran Peter Schofield, who was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor for heroism under fire during a battle near Saigon in 1969. Peter served 2 tours as a U.S. Army officer in Vietnam and is also the recipient of the Purple Heart for wounds he received while serving in country. Peter Schofield was inducted into the Madison County Military Hall of Heroes in 2005. Pete, it's a pleasure to have you with us, sir. Thanks for your time.
My honor.
Appreciate it very much. Appreciate it. First of all, let's start. Where were you born?
I was born in North Bay, Canada, in 1946. Then, actually, my dad moved to the United States when I was about 11 years old, and we moved to Schenectady, New York, where I sort of grew up in my teen years and went to college for a while. So that's sort of what I call home, was Schenectady.
I see.
And joined the military after that.
Well, what spurred your interest in the military, Pete?
Well, I guess I could say I come from a military family. My brother, my only brother, he was in the Air Force, and he got out after a few years. And my dad was actually in the Canadian Air Force during World War II, and served as a navigator, bombardier navigator, I guess is what they called him at the time, during the war, World War II. So. In my hometown, you know, there was a lot of folks that, thought a lot about the military. So it was something that I had thought about a lot doing. Plus, you know, things weren't that great back in those days and looking for jobs.
Right.
And it was a good way to go and, look for something to do and further my career and do something. So that's what I did.
Now, you started out as an enlisted man. How did
Yes,
things
I did.
progress from there? And I mean, you went to basic training and so forth.
Yeah,
So
well,
talk about the progression.
I went into the Army as an enlisted man, and ended up at Fort Dix. Went through basic training at Fort Dix.
That's in New Jersey.
In
right?
New
Yeah.
Jersey,
Right.
yeah. Ended up, of course, everybody goes through the infantry training at Fort Dix, and at that time they did the interviews to go to Officers Candidate School, and
What year was this now?
This was 66.
66, okay.
Okay, and of course I was gung-ho at the time, and I wanted to go infantry, and they said, no, your background, and your degree and your education, you ought to be going to engineers. And I said, yeah, but I'd really like to be infantry. I'm glad at the time that, looking back, they'd made the right decision for me. And then went from there to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and went through the advanced individual training for combat engineers. Went through the training out there, and then actually stayed out there, and was a assistant instructor out there for a while before I ended up going to OCS, and went to engineer OCS in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and went through OCS and graduated from there in '67, and then went on to I had some classmates at that time that. It was sort of like, what could we do to do something different? And everybody told us, well, if you're an engineer, you can never be airborne, And I said, well, why don't we try and get in the airborne school? Because we could use $110 extra a month that we
Right,
get.
yeah.
So we never thought we'd get selected, but we got selected, and we ended up going through jump school. And there were 3 of us together, myself, a guy by the name of Doug, and a guy by the name of Pete Heiser. And we went through jump school.
Was that at Fort Bragg, Pete?
No, Fort Benning.
Fort Benning, okay.
Fort Benning,
yeah.
Georgia. So we've been all through that part of the country. And, jump school wasn't really too bad for me because after OCS, they push it pretty hard. So the only different thing was jumping out of an airplane, which for me was an experience the first time. And they tell you that it's the truth. The first time you're so scared you don't remember it. The second time you remember about the first time, and you think, what did I really do here? You know? But succeeded in going through there and got assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division out of there. Ended up with the Engineer Battalion at the 82nd, and a platoon leader in what they've called a light equipment company, which is 618th Engineer Light Equipment Company. and that was in '67. So spent time there, and a guy by the name of Cletus Cox was a battalion commander, and he was a tough old guy. He he didn't
Put you through the paces,
he
huh?
put us through the paces pretty much. But
Yeah.
I was fortunate that I had a good company commander who was a Vietnam vet, by the way, with the 173rd. And my platoon sergeant, Willie Core, sort of took me under his wing and told me, Lieutenant, you don't need to be doing this, or Lieutenant, you need to be doing this,
Right.
And so he was one of the old soldiers and treated me very well and took care of me. And did
Was
a
that
great
part
job.
of the Ranger training? then?
No, well, he was Ranger. Yeah,
I
that's
see.
for sure. He was qualified, and they took care of me. But after Benning's when we went through Ranger, and then came to Fort Bragg. But all of the enlisted guys that worked with me, the NCOs were Ranger qualified, jump qualified. Most of them were master jumpers, Sergeant Corps. First Sergeant Corps, or not First Sergeant at that time, he was a platoon sergeant. He had combat experience, so he knew what to do and what not to do. And he tried to help prepare me for what I was going to go through in the future, because he knew where we were all headed for.
He'd been there, right?
He'd been there.
Pete, let's go back just a little bit. Tell our students about basic training. It's quite a rude awakening for a lot of young people. Talk about going through basic training.
Yeah, basic training is an awakening experience, I guess, and some would say a rude awakening, because I can remember getting on the bus in Albany, New York, and taking my bus ride down to Fort Dix, and we arrived there at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and the first thing I remember is this drill sergeant getting on the bus and screaming at us for everybody to get off the bus.
You probably still remember his face,
oh,
right?
yeah, I do. Yeah, I don't mind that, I tell you. And, then he get in everybody's face, and he'd go down and said, you, and use some 4-letter words in there. And, all right, we're going to line up and we're going to get a haircut. And we went through there to get the haircut, and I had pretty long hair at that time. We come out the other end, didn't have any hair, of course. And, then we went to, they assigned us for a barracks for the night. We actually didn't I remember this well. We really didn't get issued anything until the next day. And we got into the barracks, and here comes this, guy with this funny-looking hat on. Says, "These barracks look horrible." And this is like 8 o'clock at night.
Right.
We're going to clean these barracks up first night in the Army. So we spent until about 3 o'clock in the morning until he was happy with things.
Yeah.
And about 4 o'clock we got up again, and we were ready to go at it again. And he's going to say, "All right, we're going to start out right away going through PT." It was rough training, but it was good training because it prepared us physically and mentally for what we were going to go through in the future.
What would come later. Right.
So it'll certainly make a man out of you. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
So if you can make it through that, you're doing pretty well. Advanced individual training was a little different, although they were still pretty strict, but it was more focused on training on your MOS. Like combat engineers, we did a lot of explosives, demolition training. We did a lot of mine sweep and mine detection capability. We did bridge building. We did float bridges on the river out in Missouri, and I can remember at midnight, building a float bridge across the river in Missouri, which was kind of interesting. So it was a whole difference. And then back to OCS, and OCS after I got through AIT was again almost like going back, to basic training, because they get you in there, and not only did you have to worry about the TAC officers, but the senior OCS candidates, they sort of took care of you, and they
Everybody on you.
everybody was on you, and there was you didn't get a lot of sleep, and you didn't get a lot to eat, but you did a lot of running, and you did a lot of exercise, so it was kind of interesting. The first 6 months that way, and the first third, I guess, was pretty tough.
Right.
And then after that, they started to back off because it got into more training. What it'd be to be an engineer officer. You did leadership courses, and of course, you did engineer type courses, and got into a lot of things about design and construction of bridges and how to blow things up and how to build things and that kind of stuff. So it was an excellent experience. It prepared me pretty well for what I was going to do in the future, I think so.
Pete, tell us about your first experience jumping out of an airplane.
Well, it's I can remember that pretty well. When I went through jump school, they didn't have they had them. The C-130s were there, and they didn't have jets at that time, the 141s, which I jumped later.
Right.
But they were also training the National Guard airmen how to use paratroopers or jump paratroopers.
Mm-hmm.
So my first jump was out of a flying boxcar, a C-119.
Mm-hmm.
I think you all remember that, where it had the
Two engines,
two
yep.
tails,
Yep. Yeah, right.
and the doors and the side.
Had to go out the back.
Yeah,
right.
and we jumped in two sticks. What I mean by that is, we made one pass over, and they jumped 5 out of each door, 6 out of each door. I don't recall what it was. Then they made another pass, and they drop another 6. Because I guess they want to make sure everything was done well.
Right.
And I remember thinking, sitting, because I was in the second stick, it was kind of strange, watching those first 5 or 6 guys go out the door, and I'm thinking to myself, that's all there is left of those guys. They're not there anymore.
Right.
And then it was my turn, and you're so scared, you're so worried about getting out of the aircraft, you're so worried about, is my parachute going to be open?
Yeah.
And you go down and you get out and you try and do the right things, I went pretty well, didn't have any problems, and landed okay, and got down. And as I said, you're so worried about just getting out of the aircraft and your parachute opening on that first jump, you really don't think about it.
Mm.
It's really the second jump you think about, because
Really?
you remember the first jump,
Okay.
and you're saying, oh, I remember all this stuff
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
So I think I was more scared of my second jump than I was on my first jump,
Yeah.
because your mind is just so getting out of the airplane,
Am I going to forget to
am I
pull
going
the
to go to the
handle?
right thing, and all
Yeah.
that stuff, what's going to happen. The second one is, God, I know what happens now. What's it going to be
Yeah.
like? And
Yeah.
after that, it went pretty well. You make 5 jumps, of course, so it went pretty well.
Yeah.
So.
Pete, let's talk about when you first went to Vietnam, and what year did you go there, and what were your duties?
I went there in 1968, early 1968, and I was assigned to the 101st. And again, the Army took care of making sure soldiers were trained well for the job. At least they did back then. I think they probably still do.
Right.
But we went into what they call a Screaming Eagle Replacement Detachment in Benoit, and we spent might have been a week, maybe 2 weeks there. I can't recall right now exactly what it was, but it was at least a week. And they would take us through the basic, weapons training. They would take us through ambush training. What to do in an ambush, what to do during this kind of attack. So they trained us up pretty well, and that's where they issued your weapon at that time, which was an M16 for me. And then we moved forward. And about that time, Ted had already hit, so they had attacked Benoit, and there was a lot of actual fighting going on around Benoit. We as new guys didn't get to man the perimeter, but we certainly were worried and concerned about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they moved us up to I Corps, which is where the 101st headquarters was, to Camp Eagle. And I was platoon leader up there, and my major job, of course, was building fire bases.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a platoon of men, and basically we broke down usually into squads or groups of different equipment. Like you may have a bulldozer and a backhoe and a couple of trucks, or if you were going out in the field, into the Ashaw Valley, it was lighter stuff like you'd go into a fire base and it would be, and they would prep the fire base before you got there, because it was really just a top of a hill.
Now tell our students, what exactly is a fire base?
Well, a fire base basically is where they support operations for infantry units throughout the location. And in northern part of the country, not on the coastal plain, but into the mountains, into the Ashaw, you were up a couple thousand feet in some cases, and they would put batteries, 105 howitzer batteries, on the top of these hills, so they could support infantry operations throughout the area. And they'd build them so you'd build one fire base here, and you put your artillery here, and then you build the next fire base, and the fire base would be within range of the first fire base you built, so you'd have artillery support, if anything ever happened. And how they did that was basically they would fly in and on the top of the mountain, at least these fire bases that we built, and they'd blow off the top of that mountain with a bunch of what they call daisy cutters. And then we go in with a platoon, or a little less than a platoon sometimes, of combat engineers along with an infantry platoon. And we'd take out chainsaws and stuff, and we'd cut the stumps off and blow the stumps. And that would take a couple of days, and then after that we would bring in these little light bulldozers called Case 450s. And then we'd flatten the area out enough so they could start to bring in the artillery pieces. And then about 3-4 days later, they'd bring in the artillery pieces in, and we'd spend about 2 weeks there getting that ready and getting stuff done. And you're always vulnerable at those times to get hit by somebody, and a lot of times we did. We'd get hit by mortars or ground attacks or everything. That's what basically the infantry support was there for, but we, of course, had to be concerned about that too. And then we move on to the next fire base. So that's what we did.
Pete, you were classified as a combat engineer or
Yeah.
construction engineer. Tell the students the difference between the two.
Well, a combat engineer essentially supports a division, and their job essentially is to do things like laying mines, mine sweeping, blowing up obstacles, building tactical bridges, building base camps for the organizations to get in there. And you're assigned usually at a company level or a platoon level to a battalion or a brigade. Like a company usually will support a brigade. Like I supported the 1st Brigade and the 101st. And I would have platoons that would go out and support the companies in the operations. So it was mostly, you were right there with the infantry guys on the ground. And my second tour in the Delta, I was a construction engineer company commander. And we did a lot of road construction, road repair, bridge building, bridge repair, cantonment construction, where we went in and built base camps. And so I guess there was a lot more construction than there was destruction, as you do a lot in the combat engineers.
Tell our students a little about, and you've elaborated a little bit on this, but I want you to go in more detail about your daily routine in a combat zone. Exactly what you got up in the morning, and what'd you do? I mean, what was
if you're in an operation, and that's probably what you want to talk about, is you'd move out to the field and you'd go out basically and you'd do your sit reps in the morning and say how many folks you got, what kind of, if you had any attacks during the night, or you report back on what kind of supplies you needed for the day, whether it was C rations or whether it was explosives or whether it was more fuel for the chainsaws, or you had a broken chainsaw. So and then you went in and you started working with the troops and laying out what the fire bases were going to look like, and fields of fire, and where you wanted stuff done. You coordinated a lot with the commander on the ground as to what he wanted and what he saw was going to be the layout for that particular fire base. And you went through that day working with folks, and at the end of the day you sort of checked equipment, checked weapons. You actually supplied folks for perimeter guard at the time, especially early on in the fire bases, because it was just you and that infantry platoon and maybe a few other guys, so everybody had to pull their time on the perimeter. It was sort of a daily routine, and then you go to another fire base and you do the same thing over again. And then about every 3 to 4 weeks you go back to base camp, and while you were back in base camp you sort of replenish and sit down. And they had a movie theater back then, not a theater but a screen on some plywood up there, painted white, that you'd see some movies on. So we did that on when we got back in the fire base.
So when you were out in the field, you didn't no movies or anything like that?
No, no.
How often was mail call, Pete?
Pretty much daily. I mean they brought in food and ammunition and mail pretty much every day, at least a couple of times a day, a couple times every other day. Now hot chow out in the field was a luxury. You may get you're eating C rations probably for a week to 10 days before you ever saw a hot meal, and that hot meal was basically in the old Mermite cans, and they'd chicken the Mermite cans, and you'd have the green eggs. Y'all remember those? When they get in those mermaid cans, they turn
Right.
green when you got them.
That's right.
But they were hot, so
Yeah.
it was nice to have. And a shower, by the way, we didn't have any showers out there. So when you were out there in the Ashaw and you were on one of those fire bases, when you saw a rainstorm coming, you took off your clothes and waited for the rain to hit, and you started scrubbing down. And hopefully it rained long enough so
Long
you
enough
were
you get
staying-
clean,
you
right?
Get clean.
Now, sometimes you had tents, sometimes you slept under the vehicles and that sort of thing.
Well,
right?
yeah, that's true. In base camp, we slept in tents, and the tents were dug into the ground. I mean, the bulldozers would dig a hole, and they'd put a tent in a hole.
Right.
And sometimes they even just put timbers across the top, and we'd sleep in those holes in the ground, essentially. Out in the field, when we moved around a lot, we sometimes, just dug a small hole, or a lot of times slept under the equipment. Because surprisingly enough, with the bulldozers and stuff, those things are pretty sturdy and they're pretty safe. And
You got accustomed to it, I guess. right?
I slept a lot under the blade of a grader or the blade of a bulldozer, because it was pretty safe between the dozer itself and the blade.
Yeah.
A lot of times
That was protection, yeah.
That was certainly protection, and we put our poncho liner over the top, and that was our sort of our bunker, I guess, when we were in the field. So it worked out pretty well.
Now, you served in different sections of Vietnam. It's really a beautiful country.
It's a
Describe it
gorgeous
to our
country.
students.
Well, it's an entirely different company from north to south, I guess. In the northern part of the country, it's beautiful mountains. On the west side, and what they call out in the valley in the Ashaw, just gorgeous jungles and triple canopy, trees. And when you'd fly over, you'd see a lot of the old plantations that the French had, or some of the pagodas and stuff that were there that you saw a lot of. And then they had up in that area what they call a coastal plain. And every once in a while, I went twice, so every once in a while when I was on my first tour, you go to the beach and get a weekend or a day off and be able to truck yourself to the beach and jump in the China Sea.
Like taking a shower or a bath. right?
Just like old China Beach. You remember China
Right,
Beach?
that-
There actually was a China
TV
Beach.
show, yeah.
But I don't remember,
Yeah.
all the neat clothes and stuff.
Right.
We didn't have all that. We just had a beach we went to.
Yeah.
So it was. Then in the Delta was flat, rice paddies, swamp, for lack of a better word,
Right.
muddy. A lot of canals that were either dug or rivers. Mito River, the Dong Tam River, the Mekong River, just a lot of rivers and canals, and it was a different type of operation, and even the way we did our work down there was entirely different than the way we did it up north.
Right.
So, but a beautiful country.
Pete, you formed lasting friendships in the service. Do you still stay in contact with a lot of your friends?
I do with some, not as many as I used to. Of course, some have passed away just because we're getting up there. And,
Right.
But I do still meet with friends that I had when I was in the military, and some of those I've had since I was in OCS. So it's
Right.
been a long time.
Go back a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell us about the mission in April of 1969 for which you would receive the Bronze Star with Valor.
Well, as I said, I was in the Delta with the construction company at the time, and I had units spread out all over the place because we did a lot of work for the MACV folks. We did a lot of work for the Arvins. We did a lot of work for the local, what they called regional forces, in building bunkers and base camps and little places. And my base camp was with the 9th Infantry down in Downtown, but I took the majority, or a lot of my company, up to a place called Tan An, not Tan An, but Tan An.
Right.
And was directed to build because at that time the 9th Infantry was starting to pull out of Vietnam, and the 3rd Brigade of the 9th was staying there, and they were going to be at Tan An. So I was directed to build a base camp up there and an airfield, to redesign the airfield. So I went up there with a lot of my platoon, and I was also assigned at that time about 200 Vietnamese civilians, construction workers, to work for it. And actually some civilians, U.S. civilians, that had commercial construction equipment, so we did a lot of design. And one of my missions was to do what they call light security on the bridges between Tan An and Saigon. It was about 90 kilometers on QL4, which is the main route going north into into Saigon. And there were two bridges, the Tan An Bridge in Tan An and the Benlock Bridge about 40 kilometers further north. And we'd make sure the lights and all those other things were maintained operational on those. And they were actually defended by the regional forces and a few special forces, and I think there was actually some Navy guys, U.S. Navy guys around there also. And I remember it was about 9, I don't remember exact time, o'clock at night, and I was called down to my command tent, command office, and brigade commander from the 3rd Brigade called and said, we just had an attack on the bridge in Benlock, and they repelled it, but they've blown all the lights out, and we don't know what the problems are. We'd like you to go up there and get the bridge repaired, before something happens.
Right.
Because they were afraid about another attack, and somebody trying to really actually blow up the bridge is what their concern was. And they had no U.S. forces. They were just regional forces, and there was a small cantonment of special forces guys on the south side of the bridge. And I told the brigade commander, I said, sir, I'm not driving up there. And he said, yeah, you're right. He said, I'll send over a helicopter to get you. So he sent over a helicopter, and he landed in the helicopter, and I took myself, one of the sergeants, and 4 or 5 of the folks, I guess it was, had a couple of mechanics, a couple of maintenance operators, and some electricians. The only guy who had any combat experience at all in that helicopter was me, the pilot, and the co-pilot, and that was it. All these other guys had never, they'd seen mortar rounds come in, but they'd never been in any type of operation. And I remember flying up, and we were heading up that way, and the pilot and I was on the intercom with the pilot, and of course I had been up there in the daytime, but I'd never been up there at night. And he says, well, where's the helipad? I said, it's on the south side of the bridge. And you couldn't see a thing. Everything was just black because everything was out.
Yeah.
And he flew around a couple times. This was in a Huey, and he looking down, and he says, any wires around the helipad? I said, I don't know, So I remember they put a strobe light out on the pad. You could see the strobe light out there, and he came straight down on that strobe light, and he says, everybody out, and we got out. And that's where the Special Forces camp was. So we piled out, and we went over to the Special Forces on a camp. It was a bunker, actually, on the south side of the bridge. And met the sergeant was there, and he said, I think we got the bridge secure. He said, you need to go out there and see what you can find, because we think they've cut the wires, and see if you can find any demolitions out there, because they're worried about they're going to try and blow the bridge. And this was about an hour after the attack had happened, maybe a little longer. I don't know for sure. So I told him, listen, I said, when I'm out on that bridge with my folks, and he sent a couple of his regional guys with me. He said, when I'm out on that bridge, I said, don't you fire any flares, because I want to be, I want to be a target if you fire those flares, because I know those guys are out there somewhere. You know? And so I went up first with the sergeant and the two regional guys, and we started moving along the bridge on the side. And it was what they call an Eiffel bridge. It's, the bridge with the steel girders like this. And we were checking along the bridge to see if we could find any explosives, or we could find any cuts in the wires. And we found some places where they'd actually, cut the wires on the bridge for the lights and stuff when they got out there. And what they had done is come from the north side of the bridge, where there was a regional force unit there, overrun them and got onto the bridge. And then they repelled them and got them back, and then it was just a sapper group, I guess, probably what it was. So we got out there on the bridge, and all of a sudden somebody fires a flare off 200 yards, but still close enough. So and apparently they heard something, which is a good thing they did, because as soon as they fired that flare, I saw some stuff bobbing coming up the bridge, and the bridge was like, like this. So I was sort of on the crest of the bridge, and they took a couple of shots at us because they figured, who we were. So myself and the two guys who were with me just opened fire on these guys. And there was, I don't know, I to this day I don't know how many there were. I think probably 6, 8 maybe. And I didn't have a lot of ammunition. I think I had about 5 or 6 clips with me, and I didn't have any hand grenades, just what I had. And fortunately, the special forces guys behind me heard what was going on, and it seems like a lifetime before they got there, but I bet you it wasn't more than 5-10 minutes at the most. And we managed to keep them pinned down, and the other guys came up and they took care of them and got them out of there. And I went back and talked to the sergeant. We continued to do our work, and he says, a good thing, that accidentally, it was actually one of the regional guys that fired the flare on the other side. And he says, a good thing they fired that flare, he says, because those guys had a whole bunch of demo with them. They were going to try and blow up that bridge and get up there and blow the thing up. So,
any of your guys wounded?
No, nobody. We were fortunate that they sort of got behind the girders, so it was there was enough protection to get behind the girders. And right out in the middle there was actually a post with some sandbags. There was nobody there because at that time they pulled back, but we got behind the sandbags and stuff, which was just pretty lucky for us that they were there. But then we finished the job and we came back and we spent the night there, and I didn't sleep a wink. Figured, these guys are going to come back, because if they're going to try once, they're going to try again.
Keep
We
trying.
had the lights fixed, but they didn't come back. And next morning, a Jeep came and got us in a truck, and we headed back for Downtown, or 10N.
Right. Pete, how would you describe to young people what it's like to serve in war? The thoughts you have of possibly being killed or wounded during battle?
It's hard to say. You don't think much about it, I don't think, at the time. You just think about, reacting a lot of times. You think about it more after the fact. Well, suppose this had happened, or suppose that had happened. It's just like, being in a firefight. Suppose I hadn't seen them when I saw them, or suppose that mortar round I'd hit 5 feet closer, would I have been killed? And after a while, you just get so you don't think about it anymore. I think you just, think about doing your job, and you're sort of trained to do it that way. But I think I was more scared when I first got there than I was, after I got into it for a while. You just sort of, your body reacts, and you're just used to doing it. And I think that's the best way to describe it.
Is it okay to be afraid or scared during combat?
I think everybody's afraid and scared. I don't know anybody that isn't afraid or scared. If you aren't, you don't belong there, because there's something wrong with you, I think.
I think you'll probably want to go back to your basic and some of your advanced training, but share with us who prepared you to take the actions for which you received your award.
Well, I think my training was very well. I owe a lot to the NCOs that trained me in basic and advanced individual training, especially I think when I was at Fort Bragg with my platoon sergeant and my squad leaders, they did a great job in Vietnam. Benny Hill was my platoon sergeant with the 101st, and he did a great job making sure you do the right things and saying, you got to remember to take care of the soldiers and take care of the troops. And your first priority is to keep them safe, and remember what you got to do, and make sure you tell them what's going on and keep them brief. So I got drilled into my mind by some pretty good NCOs on how you should operate and how you should function.
Right.
So that's what I have to say about that.
Do you often wonder, would you do it over again, or would you do things differently?
No, I don't think I would do things differently. I certainly would do it over again. I enjoyed my time in the military. I enjoyed the camaraderie. It was a great experience. It certainly for me, it was an experience, and the Army did a lot for me. I ended up getting a master's degree out of that. The training I got in engineering prepared me very well for the future after I retired. After I retired, I got into a job in a company and spent 24 years in that company, and came out of that as a vice president for that company, And that's all has to do, I think, with the training.
Yeah. Pete, you were later wounded, following the action that you just described to us. Later wounded in a mortar attack. Tell us what that experience was like.
Well, it was pretty similar to any other experience I've had, except this time I got hit. And we were down at the airfield, and we were working on some fuel tanks that had been blown up during Tet before, and we were rebuilding them, and we had just finished erecting one of the fuel tanks, and we were testing it for leaks.
Mm-hmm.
And we put water in it to test it. We didn't put fuel in it.
Right.
And I think, Charlie was watching us.
The
And
enemy,
he said,
right.
aha, they're
Yeah.
putting fuel in that
Yeah.
dude. We're going to blow that thing up while they're there.
Yeah.
And the next thing I remember, there was a rain of mortars coming in. And there was a wall maybe about this high. And just before I ducked, the first round hit over just a few feet on the other side. And I cut a few shrapnel pieces from that, and some of the ground in my neck and in my side and in my shoulder, and went on the ground. And the next one hit right on the other side of that wall. And if that wall hadn't have been there, and as I said, that's the times you think
Right.
about it. If that wall hadn't have been there, I wouldn't be here today.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of thing I remember about that. And the biggest thing, you don't think much about at the time, just getting undercover and making sure your soldiers are taken care of. Because I remember after the rounds came in, and there was about 20 of them, it was a pretty heavy attack. And by the way, they didn't even hit the tank.
Really
Surprisingly
missed
not.
it entirely.
No. I did a head count, and the platoon leader at that time was a guy by the name of Jepson, was there, and a little bit of a funny story, I guess. I was doing a count, and there was probably a dozen of us with us, and I was getting a call for the sergeant and checking people off, and Jepson didn't answer. I said, Jepson. He didn't answer. And I said, Jepson, where the hell are you, And he says, well, I'm here. And I said, well, say something when I talk to you. And he says, Our Father who art in heaven.
Yeah.
I remember that to this day.
Saying prayers.
Yeah.
Now, I want you to talk about your career in the Army after being wounded. You touched on it a little bit, but you mentioned in your bio, it pays to do your job because someone is always watching. Explain that to us, Pete.
Well, what I mean by that is, you shouldn't worry about, you should always just worry about doing your job the right way.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you do your job the right way, you're going to get ahead, quite frankly. And there is always somebody out there, either whether it's a company commander when you're a platoon leader or a battalion commander when you're a company commander that looks at you and says, this guy knows what he's doing. And sometimes, there's going to be times where they're going to send you to school, where they're going to get you promoted, and these are the people that are going to make sure that this happens. And if you're just doing your job and doing it right to the best of your ability, and don't worry about impressing people, just making sure that it's done right, and that's what you want to do, and then you're gonna move ahead. That's the way I always felt, and I always felt that way even to this day. Is do the best you can in your job, and moving ahead will take care of itself. I had a battalion commander in Vietnam when I was in the Delta, and he'd always come out and say, tell me what's going on, and I'd explain to him, here's this, here's that, here's this. He'd say, okay, and what's next? And I'd have to think about it. And after a while, I got to reason what he's trying to tell me.
Right.
You need to be thinking ahead of what you're doing.
Right.
And
Always
what's
think
next.
ahead.
Always think ahead of what
Yeah.
you're doing.
Yeah.
So I was, it's one thing he taught me was, do your job, but you always got to think about what's going to happen as a result of what you're doing and what you're going to do next, or how this is going to impact other things as you move forward in doing things.
Pete, let's go back just a moment to when you were wounded.
Yeah.
Now, you were hospitalized, and you were on your second tour, is that
Yeah,
right?
right.
And you didn't have to go back to Vietnam?
No, as a matter of fact, when I was near the end of my tour, and my wounds actually got infected is what happened, and
I see.
they decided, oh, this is a good time to, you just ship you back, and I was considered, at that time, they were moving a lot of units out of the Delta.
Mm-hmm.
The 4th Infantry Division for the Arvins were taking over.
Mm-hmm.
So, everybody was, they were standing down, I guess is a good way to say it
Right.
at the time.
Okay.
So that's when I came back.
Now, you met your wife, Pamela, following your time in Vietnam, right?
Yeah, I did
Tell
that.
us about that experience.
Well, it's kind of interesting because I was originally supposed to go to Fort Carson, Colorado with the 5th Mech at the time, and decided, well, geez, I think I'll get assigned to Washington, because I wasn't sure whether I want to stay in the military or not. So
Right.
I figured I'd go to Washington and see what's going on in there. And I actually did some job interviews while I was there.
Thinking about getting out of the Army.
Thinking about getting out.
Yeah.
And I met my wife, Pam. Pam was working for the government there.
Mhm.
We got married in 1971, and I figured I'd better get serious about things after that happened. So I stayed in as a result of that. We had a great career. We went back to Fort Bragg. I went back to the 82nd. We went to Europe, spent time in Germany, came back to the States, went to Fort...
It's been a while. Right.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I would say out in Texas, Fort Hood.
Right.
I was in XO in a battalion at Fort Hood. And funny thing about there, as soon as I got there, I ended up being a battalion XO, and I'm reporting to the battalion commander. He said, "I'm glad to have you. You've just come from Germany. We're heading back on report. You're taking the advanced party back." So I had to go tell my wife I'm leaving.
Right.
And one of the hardest things at that time I had, because I had 3 children, was leaving my wife and kids. That's probably the hardest part.
Right.
Being away from your family, I think.
How many children do you and
I have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and 6 grandchildren.
Wow. Congratulations. Pete, we were talking beforehand about the importance of the extended military family. Tell our young people what that is and how much it means to someone in the military.
Well,
extended military family.
Extended military family is basically when you're gone, somebody looking out and taking care of your family and making sure they've got what they need. And it's always been my experience in the places that I have been when I have had to deploy or going on an operation someplace, that the commanders or other people made sure that my family was taken care of. And when I went back on reforger, I remember that my wife had to take my son to the hospital, and the battalion commander made sure that that the wives were there, the other wives looked out for my wife and my family and brought stuff over to take care of them, look out for them and do those things. I can remember, at Fort Bragg when the Israeli war broke out in '73. And I got my unit got called up, and we were told we were going to go to Israel and actually,
right,
and maybe end up having to go to that operation. And my family didn't know where I was or what I was doing, and the other wives and the family made sure, and that if there were problems and issues, that we got taken care of.
Help you get through it.
And another funny thing, I guess it's not funny to my wife, but it's funny to me, is when I was actually here at Redstone Arsenal years ago, I had to go out in a TDY, and my second son, Scott, was due to be born, and he was still a few weeks out. So the general at that time said, "Well, your wife's not due yet. We need to go out here and take care of this stuff." So I told my wife, and she said, "Okay, but you make sure you're back here for." And I got a call when I was on the road, said, "Your wife's having a baby. She's due to have this thing tonight." So I went back early, and I remember walking up to the front of the house, and my daughter was sitting out there, and I said, "Well, where's Mom?" And she said, "Well, she's at the hospital with Mrs. Quick next door, who was one of the other officers' wives." And I, of course, went off to the hospital, and I got there, and Madge was her name, was a funny lady, and she says, "Well, I'm glad you got here. I've already seen the baby." I said, "We have?" And he says, "Yeah, he's a healthy boy, doing well. They came out here looking for the father," and I told him, "I'm here more than the father is, so I'll be the father today," type of thing. So that's what I mean by that.
Right. Yeah.
Always somebody there to take care of the family, and it's very helpful.
Right. I know you visited the Vietnam Wall in our nation's capital. Tell us what that meant to you.
Well, it's a very moving experience for me. I have.
You have friends that names are on that wall?
I have friends.
Right.
Yeah.
Pete, you retired as a lieutenant colonel. Why did you choose to settle in Huntsville?
Well, actually, I was assigned to Huntsville back in the 70s, and I came from Fort Bragg, and I was happy being with troops at that time, and I was assigned here, and I said, man, I don't want to go there. I'm happy doing what I'm doing with the airborne and doing a great job.
Right.
And we moved in here, and 4 years later we left here, or 3 years later.
Yeah.
My wife and I looked at one another and said, we're coming back here. So we just fell in love with the place, and we came back here and got assigned here with the at that time was Safeguard, but now called Space Missile Defense Command, and retired out of there and stayed there. So we've been here ever since. We really love the place.
What is your favorite memory of serving in the military, Pete?
I think it's a couple of things. I think one is the camaraderie and the friends that I made and the experience that I've had. I think the other thing is the travel and all the places we've been and seen. So I think it's those two things, and the relationships I've had with other people and the friends I've made and bonded with over the years.
You served during a war, and through the years I'm sure you've seen a few war movies, Vietnam War movies. Do you think war is depicted accurately in most of the movies that you have seen?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, it just depends what you're watching. I've seen some that, in some cases, are fairly accurate. I think some are really just, for lack of a better word, propaganda movies, in my opinion, and you take them with a grain of salt. There are some pieces of some movies I think are very accurate and portray what happened. So I think there's a whole spectrum in there of what you see. And you got to remember, too, that you look at a movie and it tries to cram a lot of period into an hour, and you really can't tell a real story of what happens. Unfortunately, people take those movies for the real thing, and they're not. Okay, there's nothing that can take the place of having a mortar round land beside you, or see somebody that you know get wounded or killed.
What would you like for young people, especially our students, to learn and hopefully remember from your military experience?
Well, I think the main thing I would say is I think the military is a great place. If you're looking for a career or a place to mature and learn something, and you want to move ahead in life, it's a great place to go. It's a great career, great job, very satisfying. I've done a lot of things in my life, and going back to what you said, what do I remember most, what I like most about the military? I was an engineer, and I built a lot of things. And probably the most memorable things I have is looking back and seeing, I built that airfield, or, I built that, or we did this, And I can point to a lot of things that said we've done a lot of positive things, not only for our country, but for other people throughout the world.
Pete Schofield, thank you so much for participating in our Price of Freedom interview series.
My honor.
And allowing us to preserve your military experience for the people of this community. And thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you.
Thank you,
That's
sir.
my honor.
If you'd like more information regarding this interview or any interview in our Military Heritage series, please contact the Madison County Military Heritage Commission website at mcmhc.org.